On the 20 slides shown below, I present the original photographs of the Second World War from the German archive, which are in my collection. These photos are from my collection department, Wehrmacht on the Eastern and Western Fronts. If you like it, subscribe to my YouTube, like it, so you don't miss the new weekly presentations. If you would like to order 5 inches by 7 inches copies of these photos from the original, you can specify which photos you would like to receive. Laboratory quality. Enjoy your viewing.
T-20 Armored Tractor Komsomolets, an armored continuous track tractor. The T-20 was a prime mover vehicle used by the Soviet Union during the Winter War and World War II. Although the Komsomolets T-20 armored tractor was designed as a prime mover, some vehicles were used in combat during 1941. The tractor was employed as a tankette. The T-20 was designed in 1936 at the Ordzhonikidze Moscow plant No. 37. They were manufactured during 1937 to 1941 at factory No. 37, as well as at STZ and Gaz. The tractor was designed to tow light artillery pieces such as the 45 mm anti-tank gun and the 120 mm heavy mortar. The tractor could tow the weapons themselves plus a small quantity of ammunition, usually towed in a limber, along with up to 6 crewmen. Occasionally, 2 limbers were towed to increase the ammunition supply. The forward compartment provided space for the driver and vehicle commander. It was fully armored and had a ball-mounted DT machine gun. The rear compartment held the gun crews, seated back-to-back in outward-facing bench seats. A canvas top could be erected for protection in poor weather. Approximately 4401 T-20 tractors were built between 1937 and 1941. The T-20 tractor was used by the Red Army during the Soviet invasion of Poland, the Winter War and during World War II. During Operation Barbarossa, some T-20 tractors were used as armored fighting vehicles, though after 1941 they were used only as artillery tractors. Both Finland and Nazi Germany used captured vehicles. Romania had captured 36 T-20 tractors by 1 November 1941. During the spring and summer of 1943, all but 2 of these were refurbished by the Romanians. Because these vehicles were based on an agricultural tractor of which very large numbers had been captured in Transnistria, and because their Ford-type engines were familiar to the Romanians and spares were available, the tractor's overhaul and maintenance were simple tasks. In early 1944 they were fitted with hooks which enabled them to tow the 50 mm POC-38 anti-tank gun. The 34 tractors known officially as the Senoletta Ford Rusesk de Captura were subsequently issued to the 5th and 14th Infantry Divisions 12 each, the 2nd Armored Regiment 6 and the 5th Cavalry Division 4. All were apparently lost during the subsequent battles or confiscated by the Soviets after the 23rd of August coup. The BA-10 was an armored car developed in the Soviet Union in 1938 and produced through 1941. It was the most produced Soviet pre-1941 heavy armored car. 3,311 were built in 3 versions. These versions were the BA-10, the BA-10M improved version with new radio, and the BA-10Z HD equipped for dual railway, road use. The basic BA-10 design was developed from the BA-3 and BA-6 heavy armored cars. It had an improved Gaz AAA chassis and improved armor up to 15 mm at front and turret. It was intended that the BA-10 would be replaced in 1941 by the BA-11 with diesel engine and more sophisticated armor design, but the outbreak of war prevented BA-11 production. The BA-10 was in Red Army service until 1945. Significant numbers of captured BA-10s were used by Finland, at least 24, 3 of which were sold to Sweden, Germany and other Axis powers in Europe. The BA-10 first saw action against the Japanese in Manchuria at the Battle of Khalkhin Gol in 1939. Some were captured and later used by the Manchukuo. It was involved in all the Soviet Union's subsequent military operations and campaigns of 1939–1940. During World War II the BA-10 was used against the Germans on the Eastern Front, but was rarely seen after the winter of 1941–42. Later in the war, the heavy scouting role was taken over by light tanks such as the T-60 and T-70. A few BA-10s were seen as late as 1943 on the Leningrad front. Large numbers of captured BA-10s were used by Axis powers in Europe. In May 1945, a few BA-10s of ROA fought alongside the defenders of the Prague Uprising. The BA-10 first saw action against the Japanese in Manchuria at the Battle of Khalkhin Gol in 1939. Some were captured and later used by the Manchukuo. It was involved in all the Soviet Union's subsequent military operations and campaigns of 1939–1940. During World War II, the BA-10 was used against the Germans on the Eastern Front, but was rarely seen after the winter of 1941–42. Later in the war, the heavy scouting role was taken over by light tanks such as the T-60 and T-70. A few BA-10s were seen as late as 1943 on the Leningrad front. Large numbers of captured BA-10s were used by Axis powers in Europe. In May 1945, a few BA-10s of ROA fought alongside the defenders of the Prague Uprising. The Kliment Voroshilov tanks are a series of Soviet heavy tanks named after the Soviet defense commissar and politician Kliment Voroshilov, who operated with the Red Army during World War II. The KV tanks were known for their heavy armor protection during the early stages of the war, especially during the first year of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. In certain situations, even a single KV-1 or KV-2 supported by infantry could halt German formations. The German Wehrmacht at that time rarely deployed its tanks against KVs, as their own armament was too poor to deal with the Russischer Koloss, Russian Colossus. The KV tanks were practically immune to the 3.7 cm KWK-36 and howitzer-like, short-barreled 7.5 cm KWK-37 guns mounted, respectively, on the early Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks fielded by the invading German forces. Until the Germans developed more effective guns, the KV-1 was invulnerable to almost any German weapon except the 8.8 cm flak gun. Prior to the start of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, about 500 of the over 22,000 tanks then in Soviet service were of the KV-1 type. As the war progressed, it became evident that there was little sense in producing the expensive KV tanks, as the T-34 medium tank performed better or at least equally well in all practical respects. In fact, the only advantage the KV had over the T-34-76 was its larger and roomier three-man turret. Later in the war, the KV series became a base for the development of the Iosif-Stalin series of tanks and self-propelled guns. KV tanks first faced the Germans in the Battle of WWII, just after the start of Operation Barbarossa. On 23 June, over 200 German tanks advancing through Lithuania encountered Soviet armor including KV-1 and KV-2 tanks. Although the KV's frontal armor was sufficient to deflect anti-tank fire, German troops were able to outflank them and destroy them with explosive charges or lure them to within point-blank range of direct fire artillery. Of the more than 200 Soviet tanks lost at WWII, 29 were KVs. The BT-5 was the second tank in the Soviet BT series of tanks. The BT-5 improved on the previous BT-2, such as a new turret fitted with a 45 mm anti-tank gun that was also used on the T-26 and the BT-5's younger brother, the BT-7. The BT-5 would enter service in 1933, with the Red Army first seeing action with the Second Spanish Republic in the Spanish Civil War in 1937 until the end of World War II. With between 1884 and 2,108 units being produced, with production of the tank beginning in March 1933 with production ending in 1935. The first conflict the BT-5 saw was the Spanish Civil War, where 100 BT-5s saw action with the Second Spanish Republic. Francoist Spain would also use some that were captured during the war. The next conflict the BT-5 saw was the Soviet-Japanese border conflict against the Empire of Japan. The BT-5 played a major role in the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, as they were so fast that Japanese anti-tank gunners could not hit them. But the BT-5 was vulnerable at close range to Japanese soldiers with Molotov cocktails. The tank was praised post-battle reports after the conflict at Khalkhin Gol. The first real challenge for the BT-5 was the Winter War against Finland, where the BT-5 was unable to get past the Finnish defensive line, the Mannerheim Line, where their thin armor was easily penetrated by Finnish anti-tank guns. The Soviets lost many BT-5s during this conflict. Finnish soldiers used Molotov cocktails and threw them at a weak point near the engine, which, when hit, would cause the engine to catch fire and explode. By the end of the Winter War, Finland did not have a single complete BT-5. After the Winter War, there were still hundreds of BT-5s in service, but many were replaced with the BT-7 and other tanks. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, which caught the Soviets off guard. Soviet losses, including tanks, were appalling at the beginning of the invasion. The BT-5 would be used throughout the rest of the war, but not as much as its younger brother, the BT-7, or the new T-34, due to a lack of spare parts for the tank. The BT-5 was used the most at the beginning of the invasion of the Soviet Union and near the end of the war when spare parts were available. Su-76M factory designation Su-15. Main production model 13,732 units were produced. The casemate was open at the top and partly behind. The power plant was taken from the later T-70 light tank and consisted of two GAZ-202 engines connected in series. Combat mass was 10,500 kilograms, 23,149 pounds. A more reliable vehicle, the Su-15, appeared as a result of a competition announced by the management of the People's Commissariat of the Tank Industry for a light assault SPG armed with a 76mm divisional gun. GAZ and Plant No. 38 took part in the competition. Tests of the new self-propelled guns took place at the Gorohovets Artillery Training Ground in July 1943, at the height of the Battle of Kursk. The Su-15 enjoyed the greatest success with the military, and it was recommended for mass production after some improvements. It was necessary to lighten the vehicle, which was done by removing the armored roof over the casemate. At the same time, this solved all problems with its ventilation, and also facilitated the boarding and disembarkation of the crew as well as the gun maintenance. In July 1943, the Su-15 under the Army designation Su-76M was adopted by the Red Army. After production of the light springs resumed, GAZ and Plant No. 40 in Mytishchi near Moscow joined it in autumn 1943, the same time the production of T-70 light tanks was fully finished, and as a result 13,732 Su-76Ms were built. More than 9,000 of these springs were built solely by Gorky Automobile Plant GAZ, which became the main plant for the production of the Su-76M from January 1, 1944. The Su-76M became the second most produced Soviet armored fighting vehicle of World War II, after the T-34 medium tank. Under the leadership of the chief designer N.A. Astrov, since the autumn of 1943, work had been going on at GAZ to improve the SPG and adapt its design to mass production conditions. Changes were made to the design of the Su-76M. Vehicles of later series received a higher rear armor plate of the fighting compartment with two firing ports and a larger door. A tube welded to the right and left sides at the back of a casemate appeared to mount a machine gun for anti-aircraft defense. Firing ports of a new shape began to be used, more adapted for firing from a machine gun, etc. Mass production of the Su-76M ceased in October 1945. In contemporary accounts, Su-76Ms are often referred to in texts, public radio and TV broadcasting as Su-76s with the M omitted, due to their ubiquity in comparison with the original Su-76s. The T-34 is a Soviet medium tank from World War II. When introduced, its 76.2 mm 3-in tank gun was more powerful than many of its contemporaries, and its 60-degree sloped armor provided good protection against anti-tank weapons. The T-34 had a profound effect on the conflict on the Eastern Front, and had a long-lasting impact on tank design. The tank was praised by German generals when encountered during Operation Barbarossa, although its armor and armament were surpassed later in the war. Its main strength was its cost and production time, meaning that German panzer forces would often fight against Soviet tank forces several times their own size. The T-34 was also a critical part of the mechanized divisions that formed the backbone of the deep battle strategy. The T-34 was the mainstay of the Soviet Red Army armored forces throughout the war. Its general specifications remained nearly unchanged until early 1944, when it received a firepower upgrade with the introduction of the greatly improved T-34-85 variant. Its production method was continuously refined and rationalized to meet the needs of the Eastern Front, making the T-34 quicker and cheaper to produce. The Soviets ultimately built over 80,000 T-34s of all variants, allowing steadily greater numbers to be fielded despite the loss of tens of thousands in combat against the German Wehrmacht. Replacing many light and medium tanks in Red Army service, it was the most produced tank of the war, as well as the second most produced tank of all time after its successor, the T-54, T-55 series. With 44,900 lost or damaged during the war, it also suffered the most tank losses ever. Its development led directly to the T-44, then the T-54 and T-55 series of tanks, which in turn evolved into the later T-62, that formed the armored core of many modern armies. T-34 variants were widely exported after World War II, and as recently as 2023 more than 80 T-34s were still in service. The Kliment-Voroshilov KV tanks are a series of Soviet heavy tanks named after the Soviet defense commissar and politician Kliment Voroshilov, who operated with the Red Army during World War II. The KV tanks were known for their heavy armor protection during the early stages of the war, especially during the first year of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. In certain situations, even a single KV-1 or KV-2 supported by infantry could halt German formations. The German Wehrmacht at that time rarely deployed its tanks against KVs, as their own armament was too poor to deal with the Russischer Koloss, Russian Colossus. KV-2, a heavy 52-ton assault tank with the M10 152mm howitzer. The KV-2 was produced at the same time as the KV-1. Due to the size of its heavy turret and gun, the KV-2 was slower and had a much higher profile than the KV-1. Those captured and used by the German army were known as Sturm Panzerkampfwagen KW-2 754. Few were produced due to its combat ineffectiveness. The increased weight of the new gun and turret led to a decrease in speed, and the turret traverse mechanism could only be operated on level ground. Citation needed, KV-2ZIS-6. In March 1941, a single 107mm was placed into a KV-2 turret for testing. It passed testing by June 1941, after which it was sent to the Artillery Scientific Test Range at Leningrad. While further fate of the vehicle is unknown, it was possibly used and destroyed in combat while defending Leningrad. KV tanks, initially known as Malenkaya Bashenka, Little Turret, and Bolshaya Bashnia, Big Turret, the 76mm armed tank was redesignated as the KV-1 heavy tank and the 152mm howitzer 1 as KV-2 heavy artillery tank. KV tanks first faced the Germans in the Battle of Rossanii, just after the start of Operation Barbarossa. On the 23rd of June, over 200 German tanks advancing through Lithuania encountered Soviet armor including KV-1 and KV-2 tanks. Although the KV's frontal armor was sufficient to deflect anti-tank fire, German troops were able to outflank them and destroy them with explosive charges or lure them to within point-blank range of direct fire artillery. Of the more than 200 Soviet tanks lost at WWII, 29 were KVs. The T-34 medium tank is one of the most produced and longest-lived tanks of all time. Identification of T-34 variants can be complicated. Turret castings, superficial details, and equipment differed between factories. New features were added in the middle of production runs, or retrofitted to older tanks. Damaged tanks were rebuilt, sometimes with the addition of newer model equipment and even new turrets. Some tanks had applique armor made of scrap steel of varying thickness welded onto the hull and turret. These tanks are called sekranami, with screens. Although this was never an official designation for any T-34 variant. OT-34 A T-34 flamethrower tank fitted with an internally mounted flamethrower replacing the hull machine gun. Usually it was a modified Model 1941 with the Auto 41 flamethrower or Model 1942 with Auto 42. OT-34-34 was established on the basis of the T-34. In contrast to the linear tank was armed with an automatic powder piston flamethrower Auto 41 designed by IA Aristov, located on the side of a hull machine gun that, for example, compared with the solution for KV-8, has allowed to keep 76 mm cannon. The crew of the OT-34 was reduced to 3 members, at the expense of the radio operator, MG gunner. OT-34 was developed in 1941 and its production began in 1942 and lasted until 1944. All were released in 1170 copies of OT-34, not counting the OT-34-85, or about 3.3% of the total number of issued T-34-76, so OT-34 has become the most massive flamethrower tank of World War II. In 1942, were developed a new model of flamethrower Auto 42 with improved performance and 1943 OT-34 was equipped with a flamethrower Auto 42. Since 1944 began production of flamethrower tanks based on the T-34-85. OT-34-85 were also armed with a flamethrower Auto 42, mounted in place of hull machine gun. Design features unlike most flamethrower tanks, where a flamethrower was installed in place of the main gun. OT-34 and OT-34-85 have kept the main gun. Flamethrower was set in place of hull machine gun. As a result, the OT-34 looks no different from the usual line of the T-34, which made it possible to get closer to the enemy's manpower on effective fire range, without being recognized. In addition, the preservation of the main gun allowed the OT-34 to lead an equal fight with conventional tanks in its class. While most other flamethrower tanks were completely exposed in front of tanks with standard weaponry. Effective range of flamethrower was 60 to 70 meters, and using special flammable liquid reached 100 to 130 meters. A prototype of the OT-34 tank, flamethrower tank was built in June to July 1941. But in the chaotic situation after the German invasion production did not start until the summer of 1942. Flamethrower tanks were produced at the Krasnoye Sormowo factory, and were built on whichever version of the T-34 was in production at the time. By the end of the war the factory had produced 1,170 OT-34s and 210 OT-34-85s, with another 190 following in the second half of 1945. The Su-152, Su-152, is a Soviet self-propelled heavy howitzer used during World War II. It mounted a 152 mm gun howitzer on the chassis of a KV-1S heavy tank. Later production used an IS tank chassis and was redesignated ISU-152. Because of its adopted role as an impromptu heavy tank destroyer, capable of knocking out heavy German armored vehicles such as the Tiger and Elephant, it was nicknamed Zavero Boy, Beast Slayer. The project was designated KV-14, and assembly of the first prototype called Object 236 inches began on December 31, 1942. It was completed after 25 days. Plant trials of Object 236 inches began on January 25, 1943. After a number of successful plant tests, the more stringent state tests began. Object 236 inches succeeded again. On February 14, 1943, the State Defense Committee accepted it for Red Army service and immediately launched it into mass production at the Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant, CHAKS. The designation of the series of self-propelled guns was changed from KV-14 to Su-152. The ML-20 gun was slightly modified for mounting in the Su-152. Some handles were moved for improved gunner comfort. This variant had the designation ML-20S. The muzzle velocity and external ballistics were identical to the original towed ML-20 gun. Although designed with no consideration for the anti-tank role, the Su-152 proved to have surprisingly good anti-tank capabilities due to the ML-20S's extremely heavy high-explosive projectiles. Purpose-built anti-tank guns of the period usually relied on small, high-velocity solid projectiles, optimized for punching through armor. Since the Su-152, like all Su-series self-propelled guns, was not designed with tank killing in mind, no AP projectiles were issued to crews and no initial tests against armor were conducted. However, tests performed on captured Tiger tanks in early 1943 showed that the Su-152 was able to destroy them at any range with some reliability in 1943. This is only vehicle in Russian service capable of doing so by dislodging the turret through blast effect. This discovery spurred massive Su-152 production and the formation of self-propelled artillery units, which then functioned as heavy tank destroyer battalions. After the Su-152 began mass production, it was slightly modified to improve reliability and effectiveness. Initially, the Su-152 lacked a machine gun, which was a severe weakness in urban warfare and other close combat. To solve this problem, the DSHK 12.7 mm anti-aircraft gun installation was developed in the summer of 1943. Some Su-152s received it after repair. The Su-152 was the last member of the KV family of tanks in mass production, and was replaced by the ISU-152 on the CHAKS production lines in December 1943. The exact number of Su-152s produced differs even in Russian sources, with the most common figures being 670 or 704.